Are there people tuned in? All right, so we're good to go?
Yeah.
Everyone can hear me? Like, there's no issues with the vocals, right?
No, you're getting picked up just fine.
Awesome. Sorry for the delay, everybody. We had some technical difficulties, but glad we're able to start this. So I'm Toby. I'm the CTO at HEO. I've also been doing product development for over 15 years at various Web2 companies. And today I am going to be talking about building and scoping out your MVP. So going from an idea to having an impactful product. Feel free to, I know there's probably some people watching this online, so feel free to ask questions in the chat at any point in time. You can just interrupt me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So hopefully by the end of this, you can learn how to essentially build what matters most and how you can transform any of your ideas into sustainable businesses. Okay, so this is probably not the first slide you want to see, but it's fact, unfortunately. But 90% of startups fail, and I've kind of listed some of the reasons why startups fail. And it's important to just have this in the back of your mind to know what not to do. And startups can fail for multiple reasons. They can fail for all of these reasons. But the biggest reason is premature scaling. So whether that's your team, marketing, building exhaustive infrastructure before you need it, or proving that the model you're trying to build actually works. Building products no one wants. That's something that, quite frankly happens, right? You build something, maybe it's a super cool product, but the customers you're after, they don't really want it, or they're not willing to pay for it. And at the end of the day, if you don't have paying customers or a way to monetize your customers, you do not have a viable business, unfortunately. Solving problems that don't exist, all right? Sometimes we think pain points are pain points and they're not. Maybe customers aren't experiencing those pain points that you think, and those pain points are just exclusive to you, right? So if you are not intimate with the key pain points of your customers, you'll be solving a problem that doesn't really exist. And the last bit, which some people probably think happens more frequently than not, is running out of cash. But like that's one of the lower reasons of a lot of these other things will happen before you typically run out of money. So those are some things to keep in mind. So with that in mind, what we're going to talk about first is, how to define and scope out your MVP. So how can we build the least amount in order to learn the maximum amount? And I'll get into what I mean by that later. I'll also talk about some key metrics that you should have some understanding of. So, tracking what matters and ignoring everything else that doesn't. And then lastly, I'll talk about just some pitfalls to avoid and recognize so that you can avoid them. So in order to really build an MVP, I personally think there's a mindset shift that needs to happen. So typically when people are trying to build a product for the first time, build an MVP, they want to build a ton of features as quickly as possible, have something that they've launched perfectly, and they trust that the vision that they have is the one that's going to help them win. But in order to build an MVP, the two main focuses: maximizing learning and trusting data. And those are the two main things I want you to really think about as we go through this talk. But also keeping things simple and testing your assumptions. At the end of the day, when you're trying to build a product, at the end of the day, it's not just about building a product, right? You are building a product, but it's also building a business and validating that the idea and business model that you want to build is going to be sustainable, right? So every step of the process is super important to make sure you're learning the most that you can. You are keeping things simple and testing your assumptions.
Can you give an example of testing assumption?
Yeah, that's a good. So the question here for people that didn't hear, can you give me an example of testing your assumptions? So one example might be that, let's use Facebook as an example, right? Before Facebook launched, sure, there's like different social media platforms. And you might think that, oh, like by having this specific feature X, it's gonna force users to friends more, or it might force users to share more with their friends. And you think that by building this feature, you're gonna get this result, right? So you want to build something that's gonna help you like test that notion or test the idea. Or an assumption even before building might be like, you might think that, let's use Hero as an example since it's something that we're in the room. We think that, people, like artists deserves to be paid fairly, right? And we think that by having that notion, if we have an experience that allows people to get 100% of the royalties, it's something that they'll like strive towards. And so we might want to test that notion. Like, is that something that people actually care about or do they not? And with a two-sided market, you might realize, well, the artists care about it. Maybe we test that by doing interviews. Like this is before we're building a product, right? You might do an interview, you might do surveys with users to understand, do they care about this idea that artists needs to get paid fairly? Is there any like motive there, right? And we might realize that that's important for artists, but then on the fan side, they don't care that artists get paid fairly. Or maybe some fans care and some don't. So who are the fans that care? And how do we cater towards them? That's the segment of users that we want to focus on. So those are like questions you can ask yourself and test it in simple ways, right? And that's a good question. Like testing your assumption doesn't have to be like building a product. It could be, and I'll go through that later, but it could just be doing a survey, asking questions and sitting with customers to understand if it's something that is valuable to them, essentially. And another example, well, to add to that is just like in the past, a lot of times we'll build something and then give it to users to try it out without even having those conversations to understand. That makes sense? Yep. Yeah. Okay, so that's the mindset shift. And as we go through that mindset shift, it's important to ask yourself these questions. Do customers want what it is that I'm trying to build or the value that I'm trying to create? Is this something that we think our potential customers will want? Is it feasible, right? Is it something that we can actually build? There's a lot of things that maybe people want, but it's very hard to execute on and build. So you might have a feasibility issue. And is it viable? You can have something that's desirable, it's feasible, but you can't make money from it, right? Like, then it's not really a sustainable business, right? So it's figuring out, well, how can you generate revenue from it? So these are three things I think that if you want to create an MVP that is going to be viable, desirable, and feasible, you have to keep this in the back of your mind. So I've kind of alluded to this already, but I think redefining what an MVP is based on the mindset shift I've talked about is simple, right? I think sometimes when we think about MVP, we think about building products. We think about a prototype. It's not necessarily a prototype. It's not necessarily a beta or your version 1.0 with fewer features or just a cheaper version of your product. It's really crucial to understand this, that it's the minimum, so the least amount of thing that you can do that delivers some value or learning in product. And the product doesn't have to be a physical product or software product. It can be a process, it can be a survey, it can be it can be literally anything that is giving you some value or learning to give you some indicator with regards to what it is you're looking to deliver, right? Some examples of this, and I was talking about this earlier, is like Airbnb. Before they built any software, the founders rented out air mattresses, and during conferences, they would rent out their apartment and see if people would be willing to stay at their place as strangers. They had no product. They just had an idea and they wanted to test out the assumption of, will strangers stay at another stranger's place? is that something that people will actually do, right? Because if they tried it out and it wasn't something that people would do, then what's the point in building a whole software around it, right? So that's another example of testing out the assumption, and that was their MVP to see if it's valuable, right? DoorDash, same thing. They didn't have integration. DoorDash today is not DoorDash that was when they started. The founders were doing the shopping themselves. They were saying, will people trust other people to order their groceries for them? It's very simple. That's an assumption they had. They believed that people would want that. And they were able to test that by just doing it themselves. Once again, no product launched necessarily, right? So there's all these ways you can really start to shift to, as I mentioned, validate these assumptions without even building your product yet. And then whatever you validate, you can use that as leading indicators to tell you what you should be building. So this is really key. So I kind of alluded to some of these, like, the different types of MVPs that you can do, interviews, surveys. You might not see those as MVP. I do, right? Because they're minimal. You can learn from them and iterate from them. The fake door approach, right? Which is, throwing up a landing page and, maybe throwing some ad dollars towards your potential target market or target audience to understand, is there a demand for this thing that I'm looking to build, right? Maybe you throw up a few screenshots of some fake the fake product that you want, and just see, is there any value here? You could do video demos. I've done this so many times. Create a prototype on Figma, spend a couple days building something that doesn't really work. It's literally just a click through wireframes, and doing demos to potential clients and to gauge whether or not this is something that people want. Especially like B2B clients, this I found in my experience works really well. And then you can see, what are people excited about? What are they not excited about? And whatever they're excited about, you focus on. Whatever they're not, you don't even bother working on, right? Manual services and real learning. There's different ways you can do things manually without building a product. There's a wealth management product, forget the name, but what they did before building their wealth management app was they offered it as a service. And their assumption was, will people trust me or technology with their finances to help them invest more? It was a very simple premise. And they offered that service to people and learned from that. And through that, they were able to build their business and application around that. Prototype, I already mentioned, just using Figma, Lo-Fi. And then lastly, obviously, if you're building a product, make it single focus. Figure out one thing that can deliver value that you want to build, and use that as your MVP. So there's different ways, and these are just a few that I've done or experienced that I think can be very effective depending on the area that you're looking for. And as you're doing this, it's super important to go through this cycle. It's called the build, measure, learn cycle. What it is, when you're building, as I've been mentioned, it's testing out your assumptions, your hypothesis, and measuring that to see, like, okay, what information can you gather from that? So if you're doing an interview, collect the data from that interview to understand, what have I validated from this, and what can that help me to understand, to know what my next build is going to be, right? So as you build, you measure the data from what you've built based on the target users that you're interacting with, and whatever you learn from that, use that as a baseline for your next build, right? And you keep that cycle going over weeks, right? There's been times where, like, before building a product, I do a simple interview and it changes my entire roadmap because some of the assumptions that I thought was important was not. And then something else that they think isn't as important is super critical because it's what the users really care about, right? So I think that will help continuously doing this. And, I put in weeks, not months, because I think sometimes when we're building, we tend to just stay in build mode for a long time, and we're not learning anything. And that's like a dangerous place to be in because you're not getting feedback from customers, right? Okay, so once we understand and go through that cycle, and we we know or have some ideas of some of the things we're trying to build, you know, a lot of times that can be an exhaustive list. You might have do interviews and, you know, meet with customers and, you know, focus groups, et cetera. And now you have like a gazillion ideas that you think you can build or create to deliver value. How do you know what to build? There's different frameworks you can use, you know, and it doesn't have to be anything complex. For me personally, I prefer doing sort of the RICE method. Basically, it's just thinking about which one of these features has the biggest impact and is the least amount of work. That's how I see it, right? You don't have to do like complex math, but it's something that you can kind of keep in the back of your mind. And I kind of do this automatically. Whenever I'm like creating all my feature lists and the product backlog, I'm in the back of my mind, I know, okay, like at a very high level, this is going to be super complex. I'm not even touching that, right? Because I'm not going to be able to deliver value for like months, right? So that just goes into the backlog automatically. But features where I'm like, okay, this might be something that can have a lot of impact and I can do this relatively quickly. And sometimes you might have something that might be complex, but maybe there's a way for you to like dissect that into smaller chunks to deliver value a lot quicker than delivering the whole thing. The other approach is just using Moscow, which is like must have, should have, could have, would have, won't have rather. And you know, I typically see this more in like bigger companies, where maybe you have to, you know, report back to stakeholders and things like that. And you need to prioritize, you know, in a specific way. But that's just another approach, knowing that, okay, which one of these features do I need to have? And if I don't have it, I think this product will fail. Then that's what you focus on, right? If your product can survive without it, yeah, you probably don't need it, right? So that's one thing. And in the MVP stage, I wouldn't look at anything that isn't a must-have. If it's not a must-have, it's put on the back burner and like focus. You'll get to it later. So those are some way. There's a ton of frameworks out there, but these are two that, you know, relatively simple that you can use to help you prioritize which features to build. And there's different apps you can use to also like manage this stuff: Trello, Jira, Linear. I would highly recommend, even if you're a solo developer, use something that's super simple to track the features that you want to build. If you have an idea, write it down in Jira or Trello or whatever tool you prefer. I prefer Linear. It's like my go-to right now. And I just put all of my brain dump ideas in there. I tag them based on the types of features they are. And it's super easy for me to just go back in there and see like all the different ideas that I have. And I'll try to add as much details. Sometimes I'll spend like 5-10 minutes quickly scanning competitors to see what other features they have like along those lines. So I can just throw in some reference. So I can come back to it, and it's like when I go back to it, I'm in the same like mind frame, right? So I strongly, even as a solo developer, recommend, you know, using something to keep track of all the features that you're looking to build and not just keep it in your head. So once you've tested out your assumptions, you figured out what you want to build, and you know, you go ahead and build them. Like, how do you know if the features you're building or launch is working? Like, what metrics are important to track? I don't think all metrics are created equal, so we'll look at some metrics that I think that are important. So there's vanity metrics, right? These are metrics that people tend to talk about, but it actually doesn't matter. Total users, page views, download followers, revenue. Those are vanity metrics because they don't tell you the story if those numbers are going down. So if your total users are declining, I don't know if it's because, you know, I'm not acquiring enough. I don't know if it's because I'm not retaining users. I don't know if it's because I'm not activating. I don't know why. It's just, I can't do anything about that number. If revenues is going down, I don't know why neither, right? It's, you need things that you can actually take action on, right? So conversion rate by channel is very important, right? This is one example of an actionable metric. By conversion, I want to explain it now because I think I have slides explaining each of these. But yeah, I'll talk about it later. I was just going to go into it. But then you have like day 1, day 7, day 30 retention metrics. I'll talk about. This is just, you know, the users you're acquiring from day 1 at day 7 and at day 30, the user you acquired at day 0 and at these days, do you still have them or have they dropped off? And we'll get into more of that later. Custom acquisition cost is another important actionable metric. And then activation rate is another important metric. And we'll get into all those metrics in a second. But if these metrics change, you tend to know what to do. Like you have an idea of, what actions you can take to optimize those metrics. So the first one we'll talk about is conversion rate, right? Now, for an MVP, this isn't always as important because you're not always throwing ads or trying to optimize for conversion when you're super early in your MVP. But I still think depending on the type of MVP you're doing, so if you have a landing page or something where you're throwing money into ads or SEO or LinkedIn, etc., and this is at an MVP, this is something that is important by channel. So by channel, what I mean is looking at all the different channels that you're optimizing for, right? So whether that's SEO, Twitter, Google Ads, and then within those channels itself, you can go further. For example, with Meta ads, you can look at, reels versus posts versus stories. Which one is giving me the most conversions, right? Because if you look at your conversion rate in general, you can be oh, well, I've gotten, 50 signups, I have a 5% conversion rate, right? But you might have a 90% conversion rate in one channel and 2% in another channel, and the cost of acquisition per customer is a lot higher from those channels. So why would you continue to funnel more money into that? That's why it's important to break down what you're converting by these channels, and you can dissect that even more. I use Meta ads all the time, and I'm obsessed with conversions. Testing out different ads, seeing what's functioning, and seeing even from countries, from the device type, from the medium, like I said, stories, reels, posts, different ads will work different on different channels, and you want to be able to optimize for that so that you have the most amount of conversions. So that's what that is. So whatever you're converting on, you double down on it. Whatever that's not converting, you kill immediately. When I use Meta ads, I know if something's converting within the day, right? If it's not converting, I kill it right away. There's no point, right? Because you're just kind of throwing money into it, right? So that's something that's super important. And tools you can help use to track some of this. You can use obviously things like Google Analytics, Mixpanel, et cetera. There's tons of tools out there to help you with that data. Your retention metrics, okay? So this is very important. What this is, especially when you're building an MVP, right? It's looking at, okay, I've gotten users in, 100 users is day 0. They all signed up for my app. At day 1, what does that look like, right? If I've already gotten, 60% drop off by day 1, that means there's some issue with onboarding, and users don't see value in actually proceeding with my app. So I need to fix that, right? To make sure that, if I don't even have those users from day 0, continuing to use my app, there's something's broke with my onboarding, and I need to address that experience. By day 7, if your day 0 users have dropped off, your product probably sucks. And there's issues that you need to fix within your product. It's not delivering enough value, right? And by day 30, the user that's still there, that means established product market fit, essentially. That means you've established product market fit. So if you acquire a user today, and by the end of the month, they're still using your product, you've established product market fit, essentially, because that user is continuously using your app and they see some value with it, right? Which is obviously very, very hard to achieve. But the key ones to really focus on is those earlier on understanding why is it not sticky and why they're not staying, and optimizing for that. And yeah, there's different ways you can obviously do this, and I'll get into some of those ways later as well. But it's just like you can look at you can look up these charts online, but it's just an example of like retention benchmarks, like what's a good retention, what's not. Essentially, like great retention is essentially flatlining, kind of. Essentially, like the users you've acquired from day zero continue to stay.
I just have a question about the previous slide. When you talk about drop off,
Mm-hmm.
does that mean so they sign up and then you don't see them log back on in the first 7 days?
Yeah.
Ever, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody logs back in after the 7 days, there's still value in that.
It depends on your product, right? Like if your product is one of those things where, you know, it depends on the cadence of like, if you're building a social media app and someone logs in 10 days later, then there's probably some issue with your product, right? But if your product is something where maybe it's used once a week, then you adjust like these metrics based on that, right? So these are based on like daily usage type applications. But if your usage is not daily, then you might want to adjust these metrics to like fit your usage essentially, right? You otherwise you'll get false indicators essentially. Okay. That makes sense?
Yep.
And yeah, so like I said, there's different benchmarks. So I think, one good thing to know is potentially like researching like, within your industry, what does like a good retention look like? Because there might be some industries where, the retention just industry wide is very difficult to attain. Like I think gaming is one of those where the retention is super low because there's so many options, right? So it's really hard to get stickiness. So if you know what the industry benchmarks are, then at least it's something you can kind of like know if you're along those lines or not, right? So it might be super helpful. Customer acquisition cost. So this kind of goes in line with what I was mentioning before, where when you're looking at your costs per channel, essentially just making sure that, any ads that you're putting towards different channels, like if it's not converting, you're kind of dropping those. So I've kind of explained this previously, so I won't go too deep into it. And then the other metric is activation rate. So this is super important, I think, especially when you're building an MVP, right? It's trying to figure out like, what the key action that needs to happen on your app, but really figuring out like the percentage of users that have really done that key thing, right? So it's figuring out like what is the key thing that is a leading indicator to tell me that I have a successful app. So I have some examples here, like with Slack, right? They realize that, once a team sends over 2,000 messages, then with those teams, they see a 93% retention, right? Meaning if teams send at least 2,000 messages, they're gonna keep those users essentially. So that's their like aha moment in that, like that's the key activation that they're looking for and optimizing for. With Dropbox, it's a little different. Their thing was like once user upload and syncs for the first time, they see that those users are 10 times more likely to become a paying customer, right? So that's their indicator that they're using. With Netflix, it's different, right? They've realized that once someone watches a full episode or movie, those people tend to convert to paying customers, right? So it's basically finding the thing that people do that gives them the push to retain, right? And like that might be difficult to do, but there's different ways you can figure out how to find that key thing, right? Because it's not something that you can just like think about, right? So one way, which I would recommend, is just tracking cohorts. So I mentioned like your day zero users and like tracking them, right? One of the things I haven't mentioned is the whole concept of like a leaky bucket, right? Basically, like sometimes you're getting a ton of users, but you're also losing a lot of users, but it feels like your business is still successful because the overall user count is going up. But by analyzing cohorts of users, it helps you keep track of specific user base. So you keep track of the new users that came in this month, right? You're not throwing them in the same bucket as the users you acquired last month. Right? They're different, right? So the users you acquired this month, you're tracking what actions correlate to the folks that like stick around by the end of the month, right? What are you noticing that they're all doing? So you might start to notice patterns, right? And there's different apps you can use to track stuff like this, right? But some example is like, with some apps, I think it was Facebook, where it's like, they realized that like if 80% of people that uploaded their profile picture, 20% of them stuck around, if that's all they did. They realized that, for people that added at least 7 friends, right, they had a 90% retention with those people, right? And then the people that posted once, they had a 30% retention. So obviously they're gonna focus on optimizing for people that are adding friends because they realize like that is one of the triggers that is causing people to stay on the app the most because they're adding their friends and they're doing whatever they want with their friends on the app, right? So it's good to kind of track different user interactions and understand, of these interactions, which one correlate to the people that are still staying on the product or using the product that I'm using. And then the other way you can try to find that moment is just surveying users, right? So for users that are still on your app 6 months in, asking them like, at what point did they realize the product was valuable to them, and just getting insights. And this does take like some skill in like not asking leading questions and kind of just, asking them about their experience as a whole. I know sometimes when we interview customers or users, we're trying to push certain features or like ideas to them. But, I would highly recommend, when you're having these conversations, you're more listening to them about their pain points, even with their app, no matter how uncomfortable it is to hear, but understanding like what they find valuable, how you can make their life easier. What alternatives are they using instead of using your product, right? What do they wish that they can have to make their life, like those are things you can understand. But if they're still sticking around, truly understanding why they're sticking around will help you get more insights to like how to continuously like activate new users going forward, right? So, if you can't activate users, then don't try to acquire new ones, right? That's really important. I remember I was working with one company and just advising them, and they had been putting a ton of money to Google Ads and like just getting a ton of users, but they weren't keeping any of them, right? So they would have like 2,000, monthly users come in, and literally most of them were gone by the next month. And they were like, oh, we need to grow more users. But the question I would always ask them is, the users that you did get, what are you doing with them? Like, if they're not using your app, it means it's not sticky enough. So throwing more ad dollars and trying to acquire a new one is not going to serve you well. So go back to the drawing board to really understand, like, what should we be building to make sure that the ones that we do acquire, we're keeping them and making sure that they're having a great experience with the app we're building. So that's something that's important to note there. And then the last bit with metrics is just knowing what your North Star is, right? And so one metric that kind of you can track towards everything, right? So here's kind of every company has a North Star metric that they're tracking towards, right? And no matter what sub metrics or goals they have, everything will track to this one. So with Spotify, it's simple. It's just how many hours are streamed, right? Because that captures essentially users' experience, right? For Airbnb, it's nights booked. For Slack, it's messages sent by teams. For Facebook, it's daily active user. Although that probably changes now, but those are just some very, very simple examples. Like North Star metric isn't some elaborate, complicated thing. It's usually quite simple, and it's usually one metric that really captivates like the core value that your product is looking to deliver on. And then the last piece on metrics is the pirate metrics. It's just called pirate metrics because it's R. I'm not gonna do it, but there we go. And you know, this is something that you just want to track through the life cycle of your product, right? You know, when you're in the app MVP stage, you're probably look more focused on the first three. And the bottom three would be more like as you're growing, right? So, you know, from your acquisition, right? Like, you know, how do you find users or how do users find your product, right? How are you acquiring users? And we've talked about like some of those like channels earlier. Activations, we talked about that, right? Like figuring out what that aha moment is. Retention, we've talked about it as well. Referral and revenue, we can get into that, but I didn't talk about those metrics just because that's more like growth metrics essentially. So once you have users and you want to grow, you'll notice like a lot of apps will have like, you know, referral programs or those types of things, but that's more growth stage. So I didn't bother like diving too deep into this to those since this is more MVP focused, but those are other metrics you can start looking to like once you've established product market fit. So the last bit I'm going to talk about is just some of the pitfalls. And I've alluded to some of these earlier. But I think, you know, these are things that will kill your startup if you don't keep it in mind. And being aware of them is just important. So like it's something that you can kind of catch yourself if it's something you find yourself doing. First pitfall, building too long, right? I just want to add one more feature. Oh, it needs to be perfect. I just need to refactor this code. And like 6 months later, there's no product launched, right? I think I'm guilty of this too. Like as a developer, I just love building, so I keep building. But when I put my product hat on, I have to give myself a few slaps to be like, you know, like stop this, you know? So I get it. Sometimes when you're a dev or very technical or you love that, you just want to build all the features or you need to refactor certain things and, you know, like it doesn't help. I think just try to get something out as quickly as possible. Right? In weeks, ideally. It doesn't matter how scrappy it is or shit it looks, just get something out. If you Google all your favorite startups and look what their V1 looked like, you'll realize how horrible it looked for some of them, right? Like Spotify didn't even have pictures. Like there was no pictures, nothing. It was just, their main assumption was, will people stream music? Like literally, that's all they cared about. And they took the single product approach, which was like, we're gonna make this the fastest way to stream music, period. They didn't have all of the bells and whistles that they have now. It was just like pretty shitty version, right? But that was their thing. They were combating piracy at the time and they wanted to see if it's something that would be true, right? Solving the wrong problem, I talked about this earlier, right? Building what no one wants, right? Like, you know, sometimes we fall in love with our ideas, right? Without fully understanding what the problems we're trying to deal with, right? So I can't stress this enough. Don't fall in love with the solution you're building because that can change, right? Slack, I don't know if you guys know the story of Slack, but it was a video game company or something before it became Slack. The company actually died and they wanted to return the money back to investors. But the investors told them to keep it. And for some reason, they had an aha moment where they realized like there was a messaging feature they had built within the game that everyone loved. That is how Slack became to be, right? They weren't solving a messaging problem. They just happened to stumble on an opportunity and like looked at certain indicators and that's what they did, right? So, you know, if the solution isn't working, like just try to, you know, be more intimate with the problem, right? Ignoring customer feedback. Sometimes what we see might contradict the vision that we have. And, you know, when that happens, trust the data, like trust what you're seeing and figure out how to like iterate on that, right? Don't ignore the feedback you're getting from your customer is never wrong. Just remember that. Right. I mean, sometimes they are, right? I think if your customer is like, oh, I want a feature that does this, don't listen to that neither. Understand why they want those features, right? A lot of times, I've been in situations where the customer's like, I would love if I could do this. And then I ask them, well, why? Why do you want to do that? What do you think this is going to solve for you? And then when you get to the root of it, you realize that the feature that they were asking for, if you had built it, it would have not solved their problem because they think that feature is what's going to solve their problem, right? So it's super understand to like when you're getting customer feedback, don't ignore it, but dig deeper, right? Really try to hone in on the struggles and problems that they're having so that you can build an MVP that's viable. Focusing on the wrong metrics. I talked about this a lot with like vanity metrics, right? And I have an example here with Groupon. We all know Groupon, right? Groupon, I've used Groupon tons of times, right? But their main focus was on, and I think it's Groupon's. They focus on like revenue, how much cities they've launched in, but they had a leaky bucket problem, right? As the revenue grew, their retention declined, right? So a lot of the early users that were using Groupon, they didn't stay with the product, but they kept acquiring new users. So they didn't realize that they had a problem because revenues were still growing. And this is why segmenting and having your user base in specific cohorts is so important because then you can learn. Like if you see that certain cohorts aren't being retained and you compare that to different cohorts, then you realize you actually have a problem, right? And even though your revenue is increasing, you can actually maximize revenue even more if you look into that data and optimize for it. And then the last piece I talked about is premature scaling, right? Trying to build, I talked to a lot of startups where it's like, you're building a super scalable product and they want to build all this infrastructure and all of these things. And you realize what I always tell them is like, your company's going to die before like you finish building this thing, right?
Finish the log.
Yeah. You're trying to build this robust thing that's going to be amazing, sure, but you're not going to have money to continue, right? So it's super important to just like, balance building for now versus scaling. It's obviously, it's always a trade-off, right? Knowing that you will have technical debt now, but as long as you're aware of it and understand what you need to optimize for in the future, that's okay, right? Because you know that as your company grows, you can optimize and scale eventually. And you can kind of build with that in mind, right? Yeah, I kind of talked about that already. But yeah, I'm running out of time here. So just like some, tough love here is like, if you want to overbuild, just fight that urge, right? Do not overbuild, just keep it simple, right? If you have features that you love, but your customers don't like it or they ignore it, get rid of those features. Then you don't need them, right? If the data contradicts your vision, trust the data. I can't stress that enough. And then if you feel like you're pivoting and it feels like failure, just look at it as learning. Because the process is to always continue learning. So I will conclude with just like a simple action plan for those of you, especially participating in the hackathon, right? Validate your problem, right? To do that, talk to 20 to 30 customers, potential customers, do some discovery, understand their pain points, figure out if it's something that they're willing to pay for. I can't stress this enough. I remember last hackathon, I was talking to someone and they had a year worth of roadmap for a hackathon that was like a month. And I was kind of like, are you guys, you know what I mean? Like you're not going to launch. Like you have so many features, you haven't tested one of them out, right? So like, talk and validate the problem, choose what MVP you want to build and just build it. Make sure that your MVP is testing out your riskiest assumption and prioritize all your features, right? And try to get something out in weeks, not months. Define your metrics, like figuring out what metrics you want to measure against is super important, right? And map that out based on the stage you're in, right? And you can set up different tracking. I don't think I mentioned tools, but like there's Mixpanel, Amplitude, Google Analytics. There's tons of product and it is product specific analytic tools. There's product analytics and there's also analytics for ad spend. Those are completely two different things. So just make sure when you're building a product, you're using product analytic tools. And then the last piece is just making sure that you're learning and you're iterating, right? Don't worry about launching to 10,000, a million users. Sure, that can be like your goal, but get 10 customers first, right? Focus on those 10, make sure they love your product, and get the next 10, get the next 50, right? Get feedback weekly and then continue to iterate. Sometimes we try to focus on getting 10,000, 20,000 users when we don't even have one, right? So that's an action plan that I think, you can focus on as you're participating in the act. Anyways, that's it. I don't know if there's any questions from anyone, but happy to take them.
What would be your advice, if you're testing, what would be your advice to gauge if you're getting enough data to get the full picture? Someone like me, at this, right? I might be testing for something that I think is important, but I might be missing data points or perspective. What would your advice be to kind of check in?
If you're testing the right thing.
Testing the right thing, yeah. If it's broad enough, if it's too broad,
I mean, it depends. Like if you have, a specific feature that you're launching, right? Depending on what that feature is. It's just something as simple as just checking the usage of that feature, right? So if I just, once again, go into like social media, let's say, for example, Instagram launched stories, right? They took the idea from Snapchat, right? So if I'm launching stories, right, I might want to figure out like, how can we determine if stories is successful, right? It could be watch time, it could be story interaction, it could be shares. Shares is a big one. Like if people are sharing other people's stories, that means they're engaged, right? So I need to think about, what determines success for this feature. And for me, for something like stories, it's like the engagement other users are using for it. And then you can start tagging those types of like metrics along that. So story shares, story interactions,
right.
Watch time. Like if everyone's just kind of skipping through everyone's stories and that's like a signal, then maybe there's a way the story feature is designed that doesn't encourage people to engage with them, right? So like skip rates, like what does that look like? Are people just skipping particular people or types of content? And maybe I need to optimize the placement of stories and like the order in which those stories are coming, right? There's so many things that you can like look at, and it's just, there's no like one answer, but it's more about what can you experiment with and test to give you the right indicator, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
For testing, right? Like just launch it in a week and get people to test it. How would you do that for like, let's say you're making a B2B software that needs a couple of features before someone else decides to integrate it into their system and start using it, right?
Yeah.
Like if you were a company, you wouldn't know, anyone wouldn't just message you and you'd be like, let me just test it out, right?
For sure.
And
for
integrate this thing, and the next thing you know is your entire system's down because you just
For sure.
tried to mess around with this something new. So how would you go fast with something like that without?
No, that's a great question. So B2B, I always recommend like creating like sandbox environment for them, or just doing like prototypes that you can like demo with them, right? So, you might have a robust, so this is one example I've done in the past where like I created a prototype, I showed a few customers, got some excitement, and then when they start asking me like, when can we try it out? That's a good indicator for me to be like, I'm gonna go build this, right? If they're asking,
Okay.
if they're asking like, man, I would love to try this,
Yeah.
like, can you set me up?
Is that already a sign that, is that like,
That's
is that considered?
That's
valid?
considered a good sign. But if I have to push them, like, would you like to try this out? Or is this something, and they're like, I don't know, like, they're not interested in it, right? So I think for B2B, obviously it's harder, but I tend to think like, if you're able to give them like a sandbox environment where they can like play around with it and you see them, engaging with it, you can always ask for like masked data, Like, so if you want to give them a trial to like try to feature, like, hey, if you give us some data, we can mask it for you, put it in a sandbox environment, you guys can like play around with it. That's another approach. Figma prototypes, demoing it. There's different ways you can do it with B2B clients. But I agree, like you can't just give them some like half-baked prototype and be like, hey, use this for your business. Like it doesn't, it's challenging to do that. Does that make sense?
We have a question from the online audience.
Yeah.
Is that Naira?
Yes.
And then they followed up with what's good.
What's that about? What's Naira?
Stage name, I do music too, so.
I have a question. You touched on it briefly, and I think make sure you're learning from every step. I think it's a cliche, and it's complete bullshit in the startup world, where founders will be like, this failed, but we learned a lot. And then if you ask them, oh yeah, what did you learn? Often the answers that come out of that are not real learnings. Like, oh, never trust your customers, don't trust investors, don't chase your dream, like nonsense.
Yeah.
How would you stop that? If as a founder, how do you stop that trend of just talking about, oh yeah, we learned a lot? How do you actually make sure you're learning from all your experiences? How do you measure that?
I think it goes back to like what I was saying with like the data, right? So it's like, if you're learning, it's like, first of all, what are you trying to learn, right? What assumptions are you trying to test? If you don't have those questions to begin with, you're not gonna have anything that you're learning from, right? So if you kind of just went in with a mentality, oh, I try to build this product, it failed, yeah, we learned, but it's not like true learning. It's because going back to like the slide I had about like knowing what questions to ask yourself and knowing what questions to keep in the back of your mind when going through the process. If you don't have those questions in mind, then if you don't get the answers, then you're not really learning, right? So I think the best way to avoid those pitfalls, I think, is just making sure you're going into every experiment knowing what you're looking to get out of it, right? If you don't know that, you've already failed, like at the end of the day. So if I know I'm going into this because I think this will deliver this result and it doesn't, and you figure out why it doesn't, that's a learning, So that's what I think. Any other questions?
No other questions? Landon says, what's up, team? And otherwise, any other questions from the room? No?
I feel like I have some, but I need to ask them privately or something.
All right,
All good.
We'll follow up in person here from the Toronto Vibe Station. Thank you for tuning in, and Toby, thank you so much. This was
Thank you.
extremely insightful. I wish that we had a recording from Galen's that we could kind of like put your both together back to back and just be like, this is like the must watch for the
You don't have,
Cypher
yours
Pub.
wasn't?
I guess mine wasn't recorded, but I have resources and slide explanations.
Oh,
He made like a full script.
I think I recorded the audio.
You recorded the audio?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Oh,
So
that
I
would
recorded
be-
almost everything in the last.
Oh,
Maybe I wasn't supposed to.
No,
They're
that's
very complimentary.
that's fine. We'll chat. That sounds great. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.